Chapter 5. Who Do You Think You Are? Jim Taylor's maternal grandparents, Adam and Elizabeth Bardi, born in Hungary, were stars in the world of classical music. Some readers may be familiar with Elizabeth Bardi's CDs of the Haydn violin concertos with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra, recently reissued by Virgin Classics. Adam Bardi's recordings of the cello concertos of the classic repertoire with the Berlin Philharmonic have never been out of circulation, though his most popular CD today is his Suites for Solo Cello by J.S. Bach. This great musician's hobby was theorizing. His pamphlet, The Nation of Foreigners, published by the University of Toronto Press, can be found in the sociology section of university libraries. He argued that people who have left their country of origin and their mother tongue share many common characteristics which are as strong as any other national bonds. Regardless of whence they came, or in whichever new country and new language they settle, they share a common consciousness as foreigners. They are outsiders. They don't really know where they belong, yet they are at the center of historic changes, involved in everything. As he wrote in his preface, he wanted to boost the consciousness and pride of the new nation, which will be the biggest nation of the 21st century, outstripping the population of China and India. Bardi's ideas were inspired by his own life. Like many prominent musicians, he and his wife moved from one big city to another, from one country to another. Both Bardis were invited to join the Berlin Philharmonic. But those were still the Cold War years, and there was still an East Berlin and a West Berlin. And that summer, a war between the Soviet Union and the West seemed a real possibility. So the couple decided to take up the offer of professorships from the Royal Conservatory of Music in Toronto. They thought it would be safer for their daughter to grow up on the other side of the Atlantic. Besides, Bardi firmly believed that the ideal city had a population of around 1 million, and anything bigger was a tiresome mess. Toronto's inhabitants had numbered only about 1 million at the time. The Bardis continued to perform and record with various orchestras in America and back in Europe, but they also played with the Toronto Symphony Orchestra every season. They were appreciated in Toronto. They had enthusiastic fans there, and the city remained their base for the last 15 years of their lives. Their daughter was a teenager when they came to Canada. She trained to be a concert pianist, but, like many gifted children of successful and famous artists, she panicked at the thought that she could never measure up to her parents, and just as she was about to enroll at the Royal Conservatory, she decided to study English literature and philosophy at the University of Toronto, where she met Jim's father at a varsity ball. 10 years earlier, Pieter Kleermaker had come to Canada with his parents from The Hague. The surprise discovery that they had both emigrated to Canada on the same ship called the Ascania, even if years apart, was the spark of joy that made their dance special. Unfortunately, apart from crossing the Atlantic on the same boat, they had very little else in common. Ilona had grown up in homes filled with music, literature, and ideas. Pieter Kleermaker's home, unusually for the Netherlands, had no books or music, nor did he miss them. Ilona was educated, intelligent, and affectionate, 3 graces which rarely come together. Pieter Kleermaker, a few years older and studying for his PhD in pharmacology, was educated, but neither intelligent nor affectionate. A tall, narrow-shouldered man with pale skin and pale eyes, he liked to look at people with a grave expression, preserving his self-satisfied silence until he could think of a cutting remark. Once the high tide of desire had receded, Ilona realized that his pomposity wasn't a boyish mannerism, but a mask of cold stupidity. It was an all too common feminine destiny. By the time she got to know him, they were married, and she was pregnant. Jim learned early in life that his parents didn't get along. When Ilona got angry, she hissed abuse at her husband in Hungarian, which drove Pieter wild. "What does that mean?" he shouted. "Speak English." Then he started to abuse her in Dutch. His father's parents owned a pharmacy in Vancouver. The Kleermakers had planned to fly to Toronto to see their newborn grandchild, but by the time they actually arrived, Jim was old enough to run and meet them. When his Dutch grandmother came through the door, he rushed towards her to be hugged and loved. But Mrs. Kleermaker raised her arm to keep him back. "Wait until I take off my coat," she said sternly. This was the only thing Jim could remember about the Kleermakers' visit from the distant shores of the Pacific, and he never saw them again. He was about 9, in his 4th year at school, when he began nagging his mother that he wanted to have a Canadian name. "No way!" declared his father. Ilona, who was usually quite an accommodating wife, couldn't bear to see her son unhappy, and insisted unwisely that the boy should be able to change his name. In the end, the pharmacist got tired of hearing about it, and agreed that the boy could have the English equivalent of his name. "He's more your son than mine, anyway," he said resentfully, feeling less of a father. The boy's name was legally changed from James Kleermaker to James Taylor. From an early age, Jim was determined to be a Canadian. In spite of his adored grandfather's insistence that foreigners would be the biggest nation on earth in the 21st century, Jim was glad he wasn't a foreigner. Born in Toronto, he took great pride in being the only member of his entire family who was a native Canadian. Throughout his childhood and teenage years, his whole world was his native city. Having no intention of ending up like his grandparents and his parents, living in a country a long way from their native land, he developed a strong sense of himself as a Canadian from Toronto. He didn't think much about it, but his country's red maple leaf flag flapping in the wind always cheered him.